The solution to the synaptic problem that we addressed in our previous series tells us that there was a written copy of Mark's Gospel which preceded Matthew's Gospel. Matthew edited and used Mark's composition as a guide because he was composing his own. Although it is guesswork as to when Matthew's Gospel was conventionally dated, it is supposed to have taken place approximately around the year 85 AD, based on two suppositions. First, it took a little while for Mark's Gospel, which was dated around the year 70 AD, to move into other areas so it could be used by others. And number two, it is around this time that scholars managed to date the 18th benediction used in the synagogues in order to expel Messianic Jews from worshiping alongside non-Messianic Jews. In the ancient church, however, Matthew's Gospel was thought to be the first one that was written. In fact, it was thought to have been written by the same Matthew, who, according to this Gospel, was called from his tax collector's booth. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he arose and followed him. This verse identifies Matthew, the person whom Mark calls Levi, the son of Alphaeus, the tax collector. Early church writers also thought this was the same Matthew who became a follower of Jesus and wrote a gospel. A decade and a half after Mark's gospel was written, Matthew sat to write his own gospel using Mark as a source. As a result, Matthew gives us the opportunity of seeing how redaction criticism can eliminate the setting and purpose of a gospel. Redaction criticism shows the way in which Matthew and Luke edited Mark's work as they were writing their own gospels. Now, Matthew is a bit more difficult to read compared to Mark. You don't get much of a sense of a dramatic flow of the plot. Matthew is much less about the story and much more about what Jesus says. In the last first century, Matthew's gospel was composed in the context of conflict and conversation, concentrating on formative Judaism. Formative Judaism describes what we sometimes call Talmudic, Rabbinic, or Classical Judaism. This Pharisaical tradition came to ultimate shape after the destruction of the temple. Before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, there were a variety of sects within Judaism. These were the Sadducees, who were mostly aligned with the upper classes and the family of the high priest. We had the Zealots, who were military resistors. We had the Essenes, who withdrew from other Jews. And then we have the Pharisees. The temple was the main symbol of Jewish identity for the Sadducees. For the Zealots, the main symbol of Judaism was the kingship or the kingdom. For the Essenes, the central symbol was the land and the purification of the land. The central symbol for the Pharisees was the text of the Torah itself. After 70 AD, these other groups fell away. There was no more temple, which meant no more Sadducees. The Zealots were whipped by the Romans. The Essenes, who joined the Zealots in the end, were also destroyed by the Romans. The Pharisees, however, had a form of Judaism that was flexible, and so it survived and became the dominant form of Judaism after the fall of the temple. This form of Judaism is based on the religious convictions of the Pharisees and the professional skill of the scribes, also called book people. It was a form of Judaism that was sufficiently adaptable and mobile to survive the catastrophe and the war with Rome. It was this form of Judaism that entered into sibling rivalry with a new group of people who called themselves Jews, namely the followers of Jesus. The reason the other sects disappeared was because their symbols, that is the temple, the land, and the kingship or the kingdom, were not mobile, so they were easily destroyed. Those with highly mobile symbols survived. Torah is a mobile symbol, and a resurrected Messiah is one extraordinarily mobile symbol. Judaism was far more populous, far more ancient, far more wealthy, and far more powerful than this tiny sect. So what happens when a community is expelled from the great synagogue and has to occupy the storefront assembly in a shabby part of town? There's going to be rivalry and there's going to be conflict. Yale archaeologists in the 1930s uncovered a city of Dura Europus, which is a Roman city on the Euphrates in Iraq. Archaeologists discovered that as they dug up that city on Wall Street, there was a Jewish synagogue and a Christian house church. They also discovered that the artwork in each of those buildings were dramatically similar. In other words, the Jews, who were the followers of Jesus in this case, took upon themselves all of the symbols that Judaism connected to Torah. They took the symbols of a larger tradition and attached them to their central figure. Matthew's gospel is one that is best read as a reflection on Jesus for a church in conflict and conversation with formative Judaism in the last portion of the first century. Matthew's gospel is actually simply more Pharisaical in its concern and tone rather than what it is often thought of to be, which is more Jewish. The ideals of the Pharisees that were put into action through the interpretive skills of the scribes came together after the fall of the temple to form classical Judaism, sometimes called rabbinic, Talmudic, or normative Judaism. This has endured for 2 millennia and is therefore most familiar to readers today as Jewish, but it is simply the survivor among rival groups, which I have mentioned, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. As already mentioned, the Pharisees centered themselves not in the temple, as the Sadducees did, or in the kingship, as the Zealots did, or in the land, that is the purity of the land, as the Essenes did, but in the perfect observance of Torah. With the fall of the temple, the other competitive groups within Judaism fell away. As the temple disappeared and the land occupied by the Romans, there was no possibility of a king, but Torah endures forever. To the Pharisees, righteousness is measured by the faithful observance of God's will as expressed in the commandments. Christians, however, made a distinction between moral commandments and ritual commandments. This is contrary to Pharisaical thought and convictions. The problem is that the Torah was written long ago. It is ancient. It was written for an agricultural people, a nomadic people. Pharisees lived in big cities, urban, intentional communities. The difficulty lies in adapting Torah to changing circumstances. How can you take scripture as absolutely normative and yet live it in circumstances that scripture had never imagined? Here is where the interpretive techniques of the scribes, the book people, become important. The Pharisees used what was called the oral Torah. They used interpretive techniques, generally called midrash, which means to search out, as a means of interpretation to contemporize the laws of Torah. This is the backdrop we have to look at with the Gospel of Matthew against. And when we do that, we can see that there are some obvious ways that Matthew has Jesus inhabit the world of Torah in a way that's utterly distinctive to his gospel and not found in any of the other gospels. However, let us first look at how Matthew redacts Mark's gospel.